Hi there, anybody home? Hi, Don. You're on mute. Right.
Yeah, can you hear me now? I'm still
I
trying to
can.
get that's great. I'm trying to get the main sound system set up so that you're on the big speakers. So I'm going to switch sound here. Let's see. Test 1, 2. All right, I got you on the big system. Let's see though if I can. I brought a different camera. The problem with our big camera here is that it's optimized for who's ever presenting and not for the audience. But let me at least switch. See what we can do on this one.
So John, is this the beginning of class?
Yeah, right. It doesn't start until 1. I just
Okay, cool.
early so that we can work out the technical snafus and make sure that you and I are sure that we're good to go. Probably as much as what I'm going to be able to get of our student population. Got that set up now. So yeah, students are just arriving.
Yeah, I did. Your hair looks nice. Thank you.
So Karen, I have to say, of course, I tried doing the assignment. I'm having trouble with the climate access interface crashing on me. I don't know if that's something you've experienced, but yeah. I found what I saw interesting, but also buggy, unfortunately.
I'm very sorry to hear that. I actually have not heard of, and there was one thing where I definitely crashed it because I was doing a training for the Climate Reality Project folks, and I said, okay. And originally they told me there'd be 25 to 30 people, so it didn't occur to me that there might be any resource, thing. And then there were 176 people, and they were all simultaneously trying to find the same thing for the same location, because that's the way I'd structured that exercise, and that crashed it. That should not be the issue for you, though.
Well, I'll just like, as people arrive, I'll just share with you what keeps happening to me. It recognizes Oberlin, Ohio, but gives me this error message here. We couldn't fetch this point value. And sometimes it will let me look at stuff for certain dates, but not consistently. I'm very often getting this, sorry, we couldn't fetch this point's value, something went wrong. Error.
Okay, I'm gonna try to screenshot that so I can
Okay.
share it with my tech people. Hang on a minute, I'm playing with things here. Trying to make this
Not that
big
it
enough so
doesn't
that.
recognize Oberlin, Ohio. Sometimes I could do it for like specific days, but that's less interesting.
Could you, when were you trying to do this?
Before class.
Ah, okay, that's the problem. We just issued a big thing yesterday that is probably picking up a lot of secondary, I mean, CNN's covering it, so it's probably picking up a lot of coverage. So, but it's very good for me to know. I mean, it's not good that it's happening, but it's good for me to know it.
Yeah, because I just kept on, I mean, it did give me some, like I could do individual days, but when I figured I'd look at July because, you know, that's probably when I'd see the greatest climate shift index. This
Yep,
year,
yep.
so anyway.
All right, I'm saving this and figuring out what to do about it.
Tell me when you got your screenshot and I'll.
I have my screenshot, thank you.
Well, since I'm gonna go ahead and switch to my other camera here. So we need to do that. So that you can at least see some of our class members now that we're here. Again, not really optimized. Yes, there we are waving at you. So I'm not gonna spend a lot of time introducing Karen Florini because I said a little bit about Karen last class and there's some bio information online. And I am hoping that like all of our speakers, Karen will take a few moments at the front end to talk a little bit about her career trajectory from Oberlin College to the career path that she's taken that's landed her where she is now. But largely what I'd ask Karen to do is talk a little bit today about climate access and the work they're doing, the communication strategy that they're taking to try to affect positive action on climate. So without further ado, if you're ready, Karen, I'm gonna go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thanks. So how did I get here from Oberlin? While I was at Oberlin, I decided that although I'd been a bio major as well as environmental policy, that I was actually better with words and numbers. Back in those days, there really wasn't the kind of GRE prep that is available now. So instead, it happened that the LSATs test was like a week or two before the GRE. So I decided to take the LSAT and I did extremely well. And I decided that was a signal that I should go to law school and not grad school. So I did. And then, but I went specifically because I wanted to do environmental work. And and while I was in law school, I ran the environmental law journal, which turned out to be much more educational than anything else I did in law school. And then I went from there, after I did a judicial clerkship, I went to the Justice Department, Environment Division. And then I went to Environmental Defense Fund, where I stayed for a really long time. But essentially, I had at least five different jobs. They were just for the same employer, which was actually quite handy because it minimized a lot of transaction stuff. And from there, I was hired by the State Department, partly because of the work that I've been doing at Environmental Defense Fund on international methane. And I was a political appointee, which by definition means you leave when your president does, if not sooner. And so I was the senior political person on climate who drew this short straw that said I had to be the last one out and turn off the lights. So I stayed until January 20th of 2017.
This is Obama administration.
Yeah, that's the Obama administration, exactly. And then I joined Climate Central, and that's where I've been ever since. So that's the nutshell.
You want to say just a little bit about your involvement with Oberlin College, since that's also.
Oh, okay, yeah. During the time I was at Environmental Defense Fund, I served for 18 years on the board of trustees for Oberlin. And at various times I chaired the finance committee and was vice chair of the board and did some other stuff. One of the things that I focused on a lot was, climate and sustainability at Oberlin. And I'm very, 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 very excited that that it looks like the college is actually gonna meet its net zero climate commitment for next year, which is just terrific. So how many, I can't actually tell, how many students are actually in the room?
11.
We're short one, so 11 students.
Okay. Okay, so I'm only seeing some of you. But
Yeah,
not,
it's like I say, that camera unfortunately is optimized for the person at the front of the room and not the room itself.
okay, that's not a problem. I just was wondering. So that's my bio blurb. Any questions about that?
What's a GRE?
Oh, graduate record examination, which is if you want to go to grad school, you have to take these standardized tests on how good you are with words and numbers.
It's like the SAT or ACT that you took to get into Oberlin, except for graduate school, it tends to have topic areas, like you could take the GRE in biology, for instance.
So that may be in the future for some of you.
Go ahead, Luke.
Yeah. So
This is a question that a lot of people had, like when we were doing prep for this class. What was it that made working on international environmental law something that was just what called to you as the way to make a difference in the world?
it didn't. It was never international environmental law per se. It was it was deciding that my particular talents were more in the direction of law than, field ecology or something. But the wonderful thing about a legal background, which I'm not recommending, I actually think there are plenty of lawyers in the world, and anybody who has talents that could take them in that or another direction should probably go in the other direction. But the neat thing about a law background is you can do so much else with it. So I haven't been a litigator since 1990-ish, but I've been full-time, working on environment. So and for the last 20 years on climate. So and it wasn't my initial focus wasn't international per se. It was, everything. In fact, the considerable majority of my professional life has focused more domestically, more on the US than on the non-US parts of things. Although I've certainly at my time at the State Department was non-US, but and I've done some other things since then too. That might not have been the answer you were expecting, but that's how it worked for me.
We still have another question for you, Karen.
Sure.
Hi, during your time at the State Department, what did you find most difficult about climate advocacy and what did you find most easy?
The most difficult was just the sheer complexity of it and trying to keep straight. I mean, I had not done much on the international climate negotiations front, and I was the deputy special envoy for climate change. There were actually two deputies. There was the negotiations deputy, and I was the everything else deputy. But as part of the everything else, part of my responsibility was to help people in the United States, whether they were in state government, in local government, in academia, in NGOs, who were passionately interested in what was going on in the negotiations. Because this actually, the first year I got there was the Paris Agreement year. I mean, the negotiations were in Paris, and what came out was the Paris Agreement. So just, the sheer number of actors and the range of interests and coalitions and this and that not only domestically, but also then in the rest of the world, and figuring out what connections needed to be made and trying not to drop balls among all those connections. Plus all the other things that fell into my remit as the non-negotiations deputy. I mean, honestly, I tended to think of my job as taking care of all the other stuff so that the negotiations deputy and the actual special envoy didn't have to spend time thinking about anything other than the negotiations process. So, and because I joined the State Department already into 2015, and there was just so much work going on that it was quite a catch up, and no one had real time to sit down and talk to me in detail about things. I was kind of jump in the pool and start swimming. The easy thing was the extraordinary level of commitment on the issue from both the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and the President, Barack Obama. And to give an indication of each, at the time of the Secretary's office, which was up on the 7th floor, would occasionally call down to the special envoy's office, which happened to be on the 1st floor, and say, the Secretary would like to spend some time on climate today. What would you suggest? Or, tomorrow or next week. And because I was new to the State Department, it wasn't until someone pointed out to me that this is just an astonishing thing, because what normally happens for the 80,000 people who literally work at the State Department, someone says, we need the Secretary's highest level attention on this. They write a memo, it gets edited by their boss, it goes up the chain through this long process and lands on the desk of the Secretary's staff, and eventually might get teed up as a priority issue. The fact that he was his office was calling us was apparently quite remarkable. And then the other story I'll tell is, on one occasion, there was a meeting of some of the businesses that had taken proactive steps forward to say they were supportive of reaching a strong agreement at the Paris negotiations. President Obama had a small meeting with them. There were, I think, about 15 people. And there were 3 staff in the room, of whom I had the pleasure of being one. We sat directly behind the president. So it was easy for me to tell that he did not have notes in front of him. But he went around and asked specific questions to each of the participating businesses, and the extent to which he clearly had it all forefront of his mind and cared about it was extraordinary to me. And quite a contrast.
Let's not go there, Karen. Let's not go there.
Okay,
Alright.
we won't go
Well,
there.
let's hold additional questions until Karen's had a chance to talk a little bit more about her current work and
Okay,
the organization.
so are you guys seeing a full screen of Make It Local, Make It Real?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. I always like it when that works. So some tidbits about Climate Central. We're science, research, and communications non-governmental organization. We are not, we specialize in doing highly localized tools and visuals and analyses and distributing them for free to the rest of the climate community, whether that's media, other NGOs, governments, businesses, educators. We cover our impacts and solutions, but we are policy and technology neutral. We never take positions on particular policies or technologies. We do report on them, not so much on the policies, but on the technologies. But us reporting on specific technologies is not us advocating for those technologies any more than when we report on hurricanes. We are certainly not advocating for hurricanes. So I'm going to be going over the 5 major sets of key tools. The Climate Matters is the most sort of in-depth part of the discussion, but then I'll cover the others as well. But actually, before I start in on that, I'm going to talk about a different organization because I think they do extraordinarily important work on climate communications broadly. It's called Potential Energy. And I think that what they're doing is some of the most interesting stuff out there. And Climate Central does partner informally, but extensively with them. It's a nonprofit that was founded in 2017 by a guy named John Marshall. He was then a senior executive at a leading marketing firm. And I'm now going to quote from something that's on, or at least used to be on their website. Quote, John's son, Henry, came home from school and confronted John about wasting his skills, selling shampoo and credit cards, instead of addressing the biggest problem of our time, climate change. After being locked in his house for 2 days by his son, John created Potential Energy, end quote. So I don't want to encourage you to, forcibly lock your parents up or anything like that, but I think it's a pretty compelling origin story. And the point that I want to make is that Potential Energy uses the same data-driven approach of testing the effectiveness of messages. It's the same techniques that companies use and hone in figuring out how to sell things. And the companies use that data to make massive amounts of ad buys on traditional and social media, et cetera. It's about $500 billion in advertising expenses. So, in other words, they're being careful to figure out what works. And I've shared that origin story not only to emphasize that their research is based on data, which is unusual in the climate communications context, but also for an additional reason, which is that storytelling is a really important component of communication. At least for me, I remember the Potential Energy origin story better than I remember a lot of the factoids about or from Potential Energy. So moving along on that, one of the things that Potential Energy points out is no one has ever said this. They also have done some careful analysis to figure out what people do think. And they looked at, and this is from a study that was global, but for which the US results hold firm. And it's that most citizens around the globe, and including in the United States, lack the basic knowledge about climate change. And the perceived leading cause of climate change in the US is believed to be plastics, which it's not even remotely anywhere within orders of magnitude close. The other fundamental problems that people think that recycling can have an impact on climate change, which it can, but it's a small one, very small, certainly not the biggie. Less than 20% of respondents know that recyclables have come way down in price by like an order of magnitude in the last dozen years. Only 30% are aware that climate change can be affected by diet, even though agriculture is about a 30% driver of climate impact. And very few people are aware that 97% plus of scientists are in agreement that climate change is real, human caused, and serious. So those findings come from a study that Potential Energy co-authored with Yale University, called Later is Too Late. It looks across, it looked at message efficacy for 60,000 people across 23 countries. Those 23 countries collectively account for about 70% of the world's population. They studied what resonated in particular most with people around the globe, and they found consistent economic results pretty much everywhere. Economic growth and job creation had some resonance, as did reducing inequity, but health messages were 5 times more impactful. Protecting ourselves from extreme weather was more impactful still, but the overwhelming winner was protecting kids, current kids and future generations, especially today's children and grandchildren. That resonated across ideologies, including in the United States. Now, I do think that probably there is some additional emphasis for the United States on the salience of jobs and economic growth, given that 93% of Trump voters said that the economy was their #1 issue in shaping their vote. So at least here and now, I think this might be a bigger number than would appear from this particular study, which was done a couple years ago. On the other hand, I have no data to back that up other than the Trump polling information. But it is, in any event, I think pretty clear, both from many conversations I've had and a number of a significant amount of work that other people have done, that protecting kids for the future is extraordinarily powerful as a communications message. They also found that they have tested hundreds upon hundreds of different messages, and the ones that matter and that have the biggest impact are ones that feature people's faces. And indeed, they did a little analysis, and the human protagonists consistently outperform conceptual. But of course, there's sometimes when you have to talk about concepts, like I'm doing right now, right? And also, I think it's something that varies somewhat by audience. The more you can be people focused for a more general or lay audience, the better off you're going to be. In some contexts, such as professional or scholarly settings, that you probably need to lean more to the conceptual side. But even there, real people have more impact or have significant impact. So they put together a short report called Talk Like a Human, and based again on message testing, they found 2 simple foundations are among the most important messages. The fundamentals, that carbon pollution from fossil fuel stays in the atmosphere, causing the planet to overheat dangerously, and that there's complete scientific consensus on this. I think the climate community, and frankly, even Climate Central, does not do this as emphatically and consistently as we need to. So for those of you doing communications on climate, I encourage you to incorporate this in these 2 points in particular. Especially the stays in the atmosphere. Most people think, pollution stops and it goes away, without stopping to think that, well, actually for carbon, it's up there for a really, really long time. In fact, one of my favorite factoids on this is that half of the carbon pollution emitted by the first Model T cars is still out there warming the planet today. So the other key points that they included say, make it local, tie climate change to its consequences, talk about clean energy rather than eliminating entire industry of fossil fuels, and avoid what I like to call wonk speak. So save Florida beats the heck out of get to net zero by 2040. The latter may work well when we're talking within the climate community, but getting beyond the climate community, all you're going to do is confuse people. And then finally, avoid partisanship, especially in the United States. And one way to do that is simply to say, well, it's not partisan, even though unfortunately to some degree it is. So the good news is that the resources that Climate Central creates helps on every one of those points that Potential Energy recommends. But before we delve into those, I want to stop and ask a question for you. Of the things that I've covered so far, what do you find most memorable, most interesting, or most disputable? What do you, is there anything that you want to say, yeah, that doesn't make sense to me, or that you just don't agree with? So I'm going to actually see if I can pose that and see if anybody has any reactions.
Well, we could just talk. Yeah.
That's what I meant.
For some reason, I wasn't clued into the fact that one of the most powerful messaging methods is saying that it's important to reduce climate change because of protecting future generations. I didn't think like people would be that altruistic, I guess.
The framing or the real world framing isn't so much future generations, it's today's kids and their kids.
Okay.
So, because I think actually I would agree, future generation sounds like, way out there. It needs to be tied to, people now, And the fact that climate change is gonna keep getting worse for people who are now kids. And eventually their kids. Like, you guys, I'm sorry we haven't done a better job of curtailing climate pollution instead of leaving it as a big mess in your lifetimes.
One thing that was particularly memorable to me about presentation was avoiding the quote unquote wonk speak. And also just like the concept of you know, avoiding issues around partisanship. And I guess I'm interested in like why you think it's so effective to just plainly say, yeah, this is a nonpartisan issue, and why you think that's so effective.
Because of the data that Potential Energy has gathered, that when they have tested messaging that is more partisan and less partisan, and they have tested what happens when you just say it's not this is not a partisan issue, this is science, and they find that works. So it's based on their data more than my personal experience. Although it certainly accords with my personal experience, because Climate Central is very strictly nonpartisan. So, you know, it works from my perspective as well.
Luke and then Jane.
I kind of lost my train of thought if Jane wants to.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say something about like the whole like it's nonpartisan thing, like it's like backed up by data for one thing, but I was also thinking about the concept of like leveraging social norms and like how that might play a part. But what I found really memorable about what you said so far is the idea of like humanizing it and using like human protagonists and how that's more impactful than like a conceptual thing.
Yeah, I encourage you to go to the Potential Energy site. They've actually, they're in the midst of moving around stuff on their website, so it's hard to find right now, but if possible, I will dig out the links and share them with John to share with you all.
I think I've assigned this, but I think if you just search for Later is Too Late, because that's the name of
Yeah,
the report.
but
and
that's not gonna get you to the ad. The report is Later is Too Late, but what I'd love to have you, and now kicking myself for not having thought of this ahead of time and actually pulled that in. There are some, what I find extremely effective ads that they've done and that they feature on their website now, but they're hard to find. All of us have problems with wonderful websites that don't actually make it as easy as desirable for people to find the stuff. Anyway.
I was on the website before and I was looking through it, and I agree with Jane about like humanizing stories. I was looking, and then there was like mom stories, like mom reportings, and then like moms report on how they see climate being affected. And there was one being like, we can't go to the places that we used to anymore. And I was like, that's so, like, I feel like that's very powerful, like seeing it, and like that's such a simple thing for someone to see and understand. And then I was also thinking about the nonpartisan issue, specifically on being technology neutral, which I find interesting. Like, from the data that you've seen, did you see that when you reported as certain technology being more harmful to the environment, it elicited a negative response from people?
Actually, no, I need to be clear about this. It's not that I'm recommending that people out there be technology neutral. Climate Central's particular niche in the community, in the broader climate community, is to be technology neutral. So we report on technologies, and we acknowledge where they have, I mean, we've done a report on nuclear. It is, I believe, quite even-handed. It points out that it's, you don't get any carbon emissions during its production of electricity, but does acknowledge problems with waste management and potential proliferation. So it's not that I think there's an immense and very important role for people to be assessing technologies and talking about their upsides and downsides, and to advocate for certain technologies based on those analysis. But that's just not what Climate Central, we do not advocate. That was the point that I was trying to make. That make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, shall I go ahead with the rest of it? We're actually talking about Climate Central stuff?
Or-
Okay, good. Moving on. So these again are the key programs, starting with Climate Matters. Oh, and I want to make one other point, which is what Climate Central does is essentially we make high quality ingredients for climate communicators. For the most part, what we're doing is conveying our tools and analyses and resources to people in the media, in NGOs, in government, et cetera, but we don't bake the cake. We don't even, I mean, we make the ingredients. We sometimes mix them together, but sometimes not, but we're not primarily aimed at getting information as an end product to the broad public. It's a leveraging function. And again, we're not saying that everybody else ought to do that, but it's our particular niche. So we don't do that much direct storytelling, although there are a couple of exceptions that I'll mention along the way. Okay, so that's this. And one of our main sets of ingredients is our Climate Matters program. Every week we are doing a bulletin that goes out. Originally, these were developed for TV meteorologists. Since then, it's expanded to journalists and much more broadly to the entire climate communications community. Every week, the bulletin comes out in both Spanish and English, and it contains graphics that are ready to go right on the air or to be used in social media, talking about climate change, typically at the local, with data that are localized to that media market. There are about 250 media markets throughout the United States. Together, they cover the entirety of the United States. So in the heat season, we'll be talking about heat in any of a wide variety of ways, often showing trends to date. Also sometimes talking about projections for the future, talking about how it's less cold or the number of heat versus cold records being sent, as well as precipitation, heavier downpours, less snow. But not only the actual, weather phenomena of heat and of temperature and precipitation, but also their consequences. So worse air quality, longer allergy season, more icky bugs, higher demand for electricity to run air conditioners, and thus utility bills. We'll also do some sort of advanced analyses on things like being able to go to a very, very fine-grained level at the census tract level to say where the big urban heat hotspots are and how many people are affected by that. The heat season power outages, and interestingly, we've managed to pull together data in ways that other people haven't figured out. In fact, the Department of Energy cites us for this analysis, which I find wonderful. Wildfire risk to homes, again, is one of our more in-depth analyses that hasn't been replicated in other contexts. But we'll also try to do things with a little bit of a lighter touch from time to time. So most holidays, we will do something that is thematically appropriate, as well as providing the relevant statistics. When we've got more to say, then we'll fit in, and it's not just the graphic that's in the bulletin, the local graphic. It'll also typically be something that's kind of a national perspective and an explainer or two, and then some key concepts that tell, here are the basics about it. The idea is to help the climate communicator feel comfortable enough with this particular topic to talk about it on the air or in a podcast or on social media. We also include experts who have agreed to be interviewed about this particular topic, and we provide hints on finding local experts, because often, especially local media, want somebody from their region to talk about it. And because we're a science-based organization, we always have a methodology section. When we've got more to say, then we'll fit into one of these really short weekly bulletins. We'll do a report that's on a more irregular schedule. We do one on average every 6 weeks or so. And we also have sort of the basics, graphics on the basics, like what is climate change and the greenhouse effect? What is the fundamental link between CO2 and global temperature? Yes, there are natural cycles going on, and this is not one of them, because this is what the natural cycles look like. Pointing out where the emissions come from. This is my personal, oh no. Oh, there it goes. Okay. This is my personal favorite of pretty much all of our graphics. I worked on climate change for a number of years before it really hit my gut. Why it is that such a small change in average temperature has such big impacts in the real world. It's because it shifts the entire curve so that you have more of the extreme events. And that's, of course, where the impacts tend to be most severe. So we'll also do things like publicize fundamental things about, well, gee, the 10 hottest year, the 10 hottest global years on record are the last decade. And then it's in the oceans as well as on the land. And this is related to sea level rise, both because of melting glaciers and some polar ice, but also because of thermal expansion as hot water physically takes up more space than colder water. Looking at the billion-dollar disasters, now some of this is because of the growth of the economy, but it's also because we are having more big events hitting from, for example, hurricanes. And the corollary is that there, in addition to there being more of the disasters, by the same token, they're happening closer together. That in time, that has a huge impact because there's less time for first responders to recover, for communities to recover, for philanthropies that are supporting communities in, and government programs to recover, restock, resupply, and be able to handle the next. This is just another way of showing what the greenhouse gas sources are. Sorry, I actually meant to take this one out. We'll sometimes also cover the social sciences and point out what's called pluralistic ignorance, which is where people misunderstand what their colleagues and neighbors think. So 65% of Americans have some degree of concern about climate change, but in general, they think that only about 43% of their fellow citizens are concerned. This fact turns out to be true everywhere and across everywhere in the US and across ideologies. People and for example, Republicans routinely underestimate the level of concern among other Republicans. So more and more, we are also looking at healthcare things like for people who don't care about climate change, to talk to them about things that they do care about, like saving money on healthcare, jobs, saving home utility bills, and air pollution improvement. So all these resources are available through the resources tab of our website, which is searchable by keyword as well as by location. To be honest, our website doesn't work, or these search functions don't work quite as well as I wish they did. And we are about to undertake a process to considerably upgrade them. Moving more quickly now, because John, am I right that we have about another 20 minutes?
We do. It's fine if you have time to go a bit over because the class actually extends beyond that. So don't feel totally constrained by that. If
Okay.
you're not constrained by it.
Yeah, I can keep going. So but the other ones are shorter. They're faster to explain. So Weather Power is a tool where we have compiled all of the data on installed wind and solar capacity by location throughout the country. We combine that with that location's actual yesterday weather and today's and tomorrow's forecast. We crunch the numbers and are able to say this is how many megawatt hours are were generated here yesterday or forecast for today or tomorrow. Because nobody understands what the heck a megawatt hour signifies, we put this in terms of equivalencies to help people understand it, and also other things like home energy savings. We can do this by state, by media market, by county, and by congressional district. And the equivalencies that I just showed are actually selectable by the user. You can figure out which of these things you think is most interesting. One I particularly like is if you're looking at a congressional district, you can say we were number 8 in the country out of 436 congressional districts yesterday. So the Climate Shift Index is one of our newer tools. Here, what we're trying to do is help people understand that they have actually been affected by climate change. That is true of every person on Earth, including throughout the United States. And the way we do this is we quantify the fingerprint of climate change on temperatures everywhere in the world every day. And we do this on a scale that goes from 1 to 5. And because sometimes climate change is making certain, and what it's signifying is climate change is making this temperature in this time of year at this particular place this much more likely than would naturally be the case. Because sometimes climate change is making those temperatures less likely. There's a negative scale as well. You can look either by single date or a multi-day average up to 5 days. You can look in the advanced settings, which lets you look not just at the average full day temperature, but also the maximum temperature, how hot did it get? And the minimum temperature, which is especially important in the summer because if it doesn't cool down at night, the only people who can get restful sleep are people fortunate enough to be able to run their air conditioner all night. You can put a particular city name in, and then it'll drop a little button that focuses in on that, pops up a little card that says the specifics of that. We've got a bunch of FAQs that explain it in more detail. And when something interesting is about to happen, it's forecasted to be happening, then, for example, last summer, we do an alert that goes out to everybody on the Climate Matters list and says something is happening, something unusual is happening, here's what's happening, and how has climate change influenced this heat event. We'll also do retrospective reports looking back on, for example, last year we put out hottest 12-month stretch in recorded history. We did this right as the international climate talks were happening. And now we're starting to do also ones that are seasonal retrospectives for each season of the year. Some of the most interesting things, though, I think, are when people who get our materials are able to connect the Climate Shift Index to something interesting that is just happening in their particular community, like here, when the Twin Cities, Minnesota marathon was canceled in October because it was so hot there. And the person who commented on this was able to say, those temperatures are 2 to 3 times more likely as a result of climate change than they naturally would be. Yesterday, we issued a new analysis based on peer-reviewed literature that we also published yesterday. It was published in the peer-reviewed literature yesterday. That's able to show that climate change strengthened Hurricane Milton. It indeed strengthened the wind speeds for every 2024 hurricane. And we also did an analysis that went back 5 years and found that on average, hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin were 1 category more powerful than they would have been absent climate change. And that's because hot water is hurricane food. So as the oceans have been unnaturally warm, these storms have been unnaturally strong, and in particular have rapidly intensified, so that some of them have gone from, you know, a tropical storm, not even a hurricane, to a category 5 in a day, which makes it extremely hard for emergency responders and other people to prepare, because you think, oh, there's a tropical storm, who's going to worry about that? Well, the next day it's a hurricane category 5 hitting you. So if you're particularly interested in the hurricane alerts, the Climate Shift Index alerts, that's one of the types that's available through our resources page. I also want to talk about something that I had the great pleasure.
Question for you, Karen?
Uh-huh.
I was wondering, you mentioned how each hurricane, I saw it on the website too, how each hurricane was more powerful so far this year because of
The wind speeds.
the ocean.
Yeah, the wind speeds were increased.
I'm wondering if it's possible to then, you mentioned how people are very important, and a lot of people know people who've, how many people in this classroom know people who have been affected by some of the hurricanes. that have gone through the US this year. And I'm wondering if it's possible to show that without climate change, since whatever date you want to put it, where the hurricane would have gone instead, like how many less people it would have hit, or how less intense it would have been, like a tie more human personal story to it.
Yeah, well, we can talk about we can't talk about where else it would have gone. That's not really the kind of assessment you can do with this sort of a tool. But what we can talk about is how much less powerful it would have been if the ocean temperatures hadn't been so ridiculously high. And that's in fact the analysis that we do. And indeed, I think over the next few days, we're going to be seeing because this literally came out yesterday, right? And what we hope is that people in the media, people in NGOs, others in the climate community will in fact do exactly that kind of storytelling. To say, you know, here's this person who was these people who were so profoundly affected by the hurricane. And if the hurricane hadn't been that powerful, they might well not have been as affected. It's a bit tricky to say, you know, this person's house might have been, or, you know, this person's roof might not have blown off, because you never have that individual counterfactual. But you can certainly talk in a more general way. The one place that you actually can do that kind of analysis, we actually did it on an individual basis for Superstorm or Hurricane Sandy that hit New York City. I've forgotten exactly which year, about a decade or so ago. And we were able to actually do the measurement of that said sea level rise has contributed, I think it was 13 inches. And those 13 inches meant that these walls were overtopped. These seawalls were overtopped and reached this much further into New York and damaged this many more buildings and amounts of the subway, et cetera. That is a very complicated analysis, but it is doable. And in fact, I'll get in just a moment to something that helps with that kind of an approach. Does that make sense?
It does, thanks for answering.
So one of the interesting places that recently that I was particularly involved with that incorporated in a minor way some analysis of attribution was in an article that I co-authored in Foreign Affairs, which is a big deal journal put out by the Council on Foreign Relations. And then we did an expanded version of this as a Climate Central report that ironically came out exactly 1 week before Hurricane Helene hit. It talked, the theme of disenfranchised by climate change focuses on ways that extreme weather, increasingly extreme and increasingly driven by climate change, messes up electoral processes, whether it's registration, campaigning, voting, and vote counting. And I had the extraordinary privilege of doing this as a fellow at the Rockefeller. Oops, sorry. Before I get to that, I just want to mention that this is the kind of analysis that we incorporated into the report to be able to say that in the first half of 2024, which is a relevant time period because during the whole of 2024, the countries that are home to half of the world's population are voting this year. Now, some places like Russia, it's not really all that much of a free and fair election, but it's still going on to some degree. Anyway, so that's why they call 2024 the global election super cycle. And in the first half of the year, we were able to do an analysis that showed that 63 cities, home to nearly 160 million people, had a week or more of abnormal temperature in the month before their elections. So right when people are finishing registration processes, right in the midst of the big campaign seasons, of course, early voting and then election day voting and vote counting were unnaturally elevated. And in some places like India, 33 poll workers died of heat exposure because of the extraordinary heat that was going on at that time. I had the extreme good fortune to do the original work on this project as a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow at their Bellagio Center in Italy, which is one of the most beautiful places I have ever had the privilege of spending any amount of time, much less a whole month. So if anybody is ever invited to a Rockefeller Foundation convening in Bellagio, change your schedule, postpone your wedding if you have to, and go. It's just an extraordinary place.
Your wedding there.
What?
Have your wedding there.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would quite work, but anyway, real-time climate, moving along a bit, is showing what we do here is we continually surveil weather around the United States, and we're just starting to do this around the globe so that we can identify interesting anomalies, especially in temperature, but also increasingly in other things as well, or interesting times of year, et cetera. And then that we are able to pull from our other materials, Climate Matters, Weather Power, the Climate Shift Index, and send a targeted email. And these only go to the people who've asked for them, saying something's interesting happening in your location right now. Here are some resources to help you cover the climate story. And you are welcome to sign up. We typically, again, are involving climate communicators, but anybody taking an environmental communications course, I think, counts as a climate communicator. We don't publicize this for the general public, but we also don't screen people out. So anyone who wants to can sign up. And at the bottom, this is what it looks like in the relevant spot. Here's the QR code, and it's also at the bottom of each page of our website. Last thing I'm going to mention is our sea level rise work. One of our big tools is called the Coastal Risk Screening Tool. One of the key components on that is the time horizon that allows you to go from 2030 all the way up to 2150 and see what's getting wet in a particular location. It's interactive, so you can change the settings and you can look, the default is sea level rise plus an annual flood. You can look at sea level rise alone, with the annual flood, a decadal flood, a century flood. You can pull the current pollution trajectory or make it go a lot lower, or even heaven forbid higher, and some other factors. You can also use the choose map function and pull out water level. And for example, if you know that you've got a flood forecast of say 5.8 feet, then you plug that in. This is a slider, so you can go to all different levels and see again what gets wet as a result of that. Our Risk Finder tool pulls data from about 110 different, mostly federal data sources, integrates it. You select the location of interest, you select the water level of interest, and it shows you all kinds of demographic data about who's affected at that level of water in that particular place. And yes, okay. And pretty soon, like in the first quarter of next year, we are going to have a fully revamped Coastal Risk Finder that integrates directly with the maps. And this is roughly what all that's going to look like. And it's going to have the key factoids pulled out in a very handy, easy, user-friendly way. This was done, by the way, we did about 100 different user resources, user interviews to help us understand what do the users really want here, and how do we, because we know too much. That's the problem with working on climate change. You end up knowing way more than pretty much, lots and lots of people. Not that you're necessarily the world's leading expert, but you know way more than average people do. So it's dangerous to go just on your own gut feeling. That's why the Potential Energy Coalition message testing, I think, is so important, because if we rely on our gut, we get it wrong. And then the last thing I'm going to mention in this only this one slide, the one place that Climate Central does actual storytelling is through our partnership journalism program. We work with local media outlets. We go to them, we say, here's an interesting story idea, here's some data that's local for your community. We'll do the science writing, you do what local media does best, which is the storytelling that puts the, puts a frame around it for, you know, the local context. And then one other thing I'm gonna mention, the tremendous resources at the Goodman Center, which is a range of free reports and some trainings that help everybody become better communicators. So I'm just gonna mention that in passing. And then to end, the climate, you know, here again are the signups, and you are welcome to do so. The end.
Thanks, Karen. So if Karen's willing, you have time for some questions, Karen?
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount, but I
Okay,
do have a few.
5 minutes?
Yep. Perfect.
Okay. Questions for Karen? Yeah, you go.
So for this class, we read your article on how climate change is making voting less accessible for people. And then a lot of the questions that were asked were surrounding how do we amplify voices that cannot vote in the United States, like that are still being affected by climate change that the United States is causing.
You mean impacts outside of the US?
Yeah.
Well, those people aren't US voters. That's a lot of what gets addressed, not very effectively, in the international climate negotiations context. There is no great answer. It's a global problem affecting the global commons. That I do think that the Paris Agreement is important because it articulated as a global norm responsibility for doing things on climate change. But especially given that the last 3 climate conferences have been held in petrostates, we're not seeing the kind of progress that we need to see there. I wish I had a better answer.
I want to ask about what you think Climate Central's role has been in promoting attribution science. My own sense is it's been substantial. But I want to get a better sense of how you guys are collaborating with scientists in thinking about that as a tool, and how effective you think that is as a communication, as a mode of communication. Yeah.
We have done some analysis that, and our colleagues at the Yale program on climate change communication have actually did a study that found that including attribution information in climate communication makes it more impactful and sticky. And that's why we're doing the attribution analysis and why we're putting a great deal of effort into that. We do collaborate very closely with others in the scientific community. In fact, Climate Central was the founding secretariat of the World Weather Attribution Project, and even though we're not the secretariat anymore, we are actually in a formal partnership with them that is co-funded by major Bezos Earth Fund, along with the Yale program and one other organization that focuses on international communication. We have been one of the principal drivers on attribution science, and especially in doing the kind of rapid attribution, because it used to be that you know, humanity has only been able to do climate attribution analyses for 20 years. In fact, the first papers that came out were 20 years ago this year. And at that time, it took months to be able to run the numbers, et cetera, et cetera. 10 years ago, World Weather Attribution was founded because it was becoming possible to do rapid analysis, you know, in the week after or a month after, and to quickly get it out before the event had faded from people's memories. What Climate Central has now added to that toolbox is the ability to do attribution in advance. Because our climate shift index has already pre-computed everything, so when we know what the temperature is gonna be in a particular place, we're able to say the climate fingerprint on this place at this time of year is whatever fold, making it more likely. So we've played a very major role.
Any last question before we let go of Karen here? Yes.
Yeah, in the disenfranchised by climate change report, you talk about that there is already certain processes in different states for these like emergency, I guess like climate barriers and overcoming that, but do you see there being a need to have a federal procedure to account for these climate barriers to voting? And if so, do you see that being like feasible in the near future?
No, it's not feasible, given who's gonna be running things. I mean, certainly not over the next 4 years, right? I just can't see that happening.
Do you see it being necessary though?
I mean, under our constitution, states have authority over how electoral processes are run. I think it would be great for there to be sort of federal best practices, federally identified best practices and money to help with that. But yeah, I ain't holding my breath for the time being. States can learn from each other and are learning from each other. And one of the things that I want to do going forward is working with electoral officials to essentially say, it's great that you've got some emergency procedures, but you need to recognize it's going to get worse. They're going to be more intense events. They're going to be happening closer together. So you really need to enhance the robustness of your, people did not think that Asheville, North Carolina was vulnerable to catastrophic flooding from a hurricane, but it is.
All right, I think we better draw the line there, Karen, because we didn't book you for more time. Thank you so much.
Thank
Always
you.
appreciate
Been
your
a pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care, Karen.
Oh, it's us.
All right.
I keep the infinite loop.